There's Palumbo versus Zombie. That was a sculpture I did a little earlier of a zombie, and then I added this finished version, this Palumbo, to it. That was a little brief snippet of it. I'm starting off here with just a sphere. I'm outlining the facial features. It's not something I'd ordinarily do. I might just pull out the nose, pull out the forehead, etc. But I'm just drawing into it to get placement of the features. And this is David Palumbo, who's a amateur bodybuilder, never turned professional, and is known for supplement companies and his YouTube RX Muscle channel. And sometimes when you start off an image, when you're sculpting somebody or drawing somebody, you have a preconceived notion of what they look like. Palumbo has a very drawn-in face, but it's mostly fleshy, and he's not really a natural mesomorphic guy. He's more of an ectomorph. There's photos of him when he was in high school, and he's, on the track team. He might be slightly mesomorphic, but he's mainly ectomorphic. But he does, whatever bodybuilders do to put on the size these days, and really stretching out the fleshy portions of his face, because this is primarily a face portrait, but it's a bust. I'm including a little bit of the upper body. But what really sells this as being Palumbo is the face. And if you look at Schwarzenegger, for example, he's got an ample bone structure in the face. The cheekbones stick out, the jawbones, the cheek, or Steve Reeves, they're defined by the bone structure. But Palumbo is more defined by fleshiness. Like, he's got a very fleshy nose, and there's no strong delineation of the jaw muscle. It doesn't peek out. The mandible, where the angle is of the mandible, doesn't stick out on the side like, say, a model or something like that, or a movie star. Real strong definition. Actually, it's just the opposite. It's more fleshy. So when I'm doing this, I'm thinking of him as kind of as, wrongly thinking of him as kind of like a genetically monstrous guy, but he's not. It's mainly what he did to get there, whatever that means, training and otherwise, which puts on fleshiness, on the jaws and the, cheeks, etc. But he's not really naturally a monstrous guy, and it's hard for anybody that doesn't lift weights or doesn't follow this to even wrap their head around this, because you see somebody, he's like 300 pounds, he's a monster, but he's really not a natural. That's like a woman putting on a ton of makeup, or wearing $1 million or whatever designer clothes, and then she's a fashion model. Well, not necessarily. I mean, unless she's a model to begin with. Like Schwarzenegger has that look to begin with, and then he augmented it by lifting weights. Palumbo, to the nth degree, did that. What I have in my head when I'm doing this is Palumbo is kind of a monstrous guy. So I'm making this as if he was wide bone structure to the face, and monstrous 1950s pro wrestler, where they have the exaggerated facial structure, but he doesn't have that. That's why it doesn't look like him initially, is because everybody that goes into drawing something has these preconceived notions that you have to override. You got to look at, well, what does he actually look like, as opposed to what I think he looks like. In my mind, I'm thinking like, he's got Mr. T wrinkles between the eyebrows, and and at a certain point, I have him looking more like Ronnie Coleman initially, which he doesn't look like. He's and you can see what he looks like now when he's not lifting or doing whatever else he did in his past to have more of a fleshy look. And another thing, when you're doing sculptures or drawing of a person, of a likeness, is the time span of when you see photos of him. I mean, you see photos of him going maybe back 20 years or more, and he doesn't look like what he looked like then. What is most recognizable in people's minds of what Palumbo looked like now or then? And of course, he's known for lifting weights, so you have to include some aspect of him as a bodybuilder. But he wouldn't stand out in public now more than that the average person. He's leaner, and he's got an extreme knowledge base on supplementation and training, where he can always stay in shape and stay lean. So you can see a little bit later on in this, I had to take the width in. See, that's way too mesomorphic face-wise than he actually is. And this is done quickly. If you look at some of the top 3D sculptors in the world, or sculptors in general, they're not knocking something off in 2 hours like I did here. You know, you might see some of the best 3D artists in the world, and there's 6 pictures, 6 likenesses that they did. Maybe some of them aren't even likenesses in the sense that you recognize who it is. It's just a really good image. Well, I'm cranking out a likeness in 2 hours. So you can't expect, well, actually you can if you have enough experience, but I'm not at this point. In 2 hours, it's going to end up looking like him, and I'm going to get rid of this unlikeness. But there are still limitations to working on something for a short period of time versus somebody that's working on something for a studio, and they took 6 days at it. And that's with people showing it to people and them saying, no, change this, change that. No, it doesn't look like that. This is all just me, off the top of my head doing this in a couple hours. So there you can see I'm using the deformations just to fool around with me, because at this point I'm realizing, that's way too mesomorphic or extreme bone structure for Palumbo. It doesn't look like him. So I'm just fooling around. I was fooling around before with the deformations, just taking the head, making the head narrow, etc. I didn't stick with any of those, and I'm working now on making the head narrower and making it look more Palumbo. A lot of how you recognize people is through the eyes. How you get a likeness is through the eyes, and it's fairly easy to break it down when you study the upper eyelid, the lower eyelid. There's a checklist of things to do to make sure you have the likeness, and once you have that, everything else falls into place a lot easier. Because I've seen people on forums where they're asking, why doesn't this look like the guy? Why doesn't this look like the guy? And I can just, it's the eyes. I could just take a photo. I see what the photo they're copying from or modeling from. I recognize where they are getting the reference from. So I can just cut out the eyes, put it over their model that doesn't look like the person, and all of a sudden it does. This, having the photograph of the eyes put over their eyes that are wrong, even though they got a lot of wrong on the other features as well. But it's a lot to do with the eyes, and the eyes make something look more realistic as well, what they call the uncanny valley, where something's in 3D. It looks real, but there's just something missing in the eyes where it doesn't look like a real person. Now this is, of course, this is made to look like a sculpture. This isn't even trying to make it look photorealistic. If I were, I would have modeled the eyes separately as spheres and augmented spheres to some degree, and then plopped them inside the head. This is all one unit, just like a regular sculpture like Michelangelo or whoever did. They didn't carve out an area for the eyes and then model a sphere and then stick it inside the head. They modeled everything they chipped it away or with clay, as the final version of it is one piece, whereas in 3D, when they animate it, they have to make the eyes in one piece. And this is really an exercise on getting a likeness, getting it done quickly, and then I'm just explaining some of the process that I'm going through. Now, the body is not supposed to be 100% representational of Palumbo, because he obviously doesn't have traps that high, but there are some aspects that I'm caricaturizing on him that are in his actual physique. And traps can be considered one of them. He does have that, bony area in the back, which a lot of people have. That recessed area, which you can see right near the top of the neck. The chest on Palumbo, even though you'd say, oh, he's a bodybuilder, he's got a massive chest development, but he really does not, as opposed to somebody like Schwarzenegger that has, he just, especially when he's ready for a contest, just balloons up chest-wise. And in fact, Schwarzenegger really didn't pre-contest. It's really when whatever they do, supplement-wise, let's say, to prepare for a contest, Schwarzenegger just blows up and inflates his chest as well, where somebody like Palumbo or someone else might blow up taking certain supplements, let's say, but it didn't affect his chest area to the degree, anywhere near the degree of Schwarzenegger just having that bulbous look. And another aspect of Palumbo that is part of his characterization is vascularity. He retains these veins in the neck even now when he's not competing. I assume he's still training, but if you leave out those veins, you're not caricaturizing them. You're not doing a realistic even representation of him, because that's part of what he looks like. Big neck with extremely thick veins down the front, not just cephalic veins on the side of the neck, but veins in the front of the neck crisscrossing around. And of course, what I'm doing there is just masking off the hair and then just inflating that area a little bit so it's raised to show his hair. That's another extreme area of Palumbo that you could caricaturize. Like if I were to make that totally black on his head, of course this is all one tone as a sculpture, but if I were to make it totally black on the top of the head, that would really look like what he looks like now, which is he is in those aspects of him that are caricaturized on the real person Palumbo. And Palumbo's got really blue eyes, and that's a characterization that stands out a lot, and I'm adding that to the sculpture. But there are techniques to do eyes in sculpture. Like I said before, you can make the eyes separately as a sphere, put them in. That's probably the best way to, that's obviously the best way to do if you're animating them. But if you're just doing sculpture, trying to get a likeness, this is not necessarily the best way to do it. I'm just doing this as a quick thing where I'm just making a spherical shape for the iris of the eye, the colored part of the eye, and then just making an indent for the pupil. But I'll do a tutorial or do some examples of other ways. There's a myriad of methods that you can do to create that look, even creating a look of a highlight on the eye by recessing the pupil and then making a little area that stands out as the white highlight, which is a cheat, because obviously there's no white highlight there, but you're creating one to fool the eye. And you got to look at these photos that you're referencing from every single angle, because you might get used to it with a lot of experience. I'm still not at that level where I'm looking at stuff from the front and I'm able to determine 100% what their side view looks like. Sometimes it's surprising when you just see someone from the front, and then you're sculpting them and it looks pretty good from the front, and then something's just not right from the side. Then you finally do see reference from the side, and it really hits home on how to straighten out the whole thing. Now here I'm just adding, this is within ZBrush. ZBrush has a not so good, and I'm not really into the materials and the render in ZBrush, because there's better renderers. It's the best modeling program, but there's better renderers and materials in other programs. And then I take it into Blender, and I do this quick animation with that sculpture of the zombie that I did in a previous video, and that's it.